February 19th, 1942. The Oval Office. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's hand trembles slightly as he signs Executive Order 9066. The scratching of his pen echoes through the room, a sound that will reverberate through the lives of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Outside, a nation gripped by war hysteria demands action. Inside, with a single signature, Roosevelt authorizes the forced removal of an entire ethnic group from the West Coast, 2/3 of them American citizens. 3 months earlier, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sky erupts in flame and smoke as Japanese bombers descend upon the unsuspecting American fleet. Within hours, 2,403 Americans lie dead. The attack sends shockwaves across the Pacific to mainland America, where families like theInouyes in Los Angeles gather around radios in stunned silence. For 22-year-old Daniel Inouye in Honolulu, the world has changed forever. The sky was filled with black smoke, he later recalled. I felt that my future was blasted. My dreams were destroyed. Like thousands of Japanese Americans, he immediately volunteers to serve the country that will soon imprison his relatives. January 1942, San Francisco. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, pounds his fist on his desk as he dictates a report to Washington. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second- and third-generation Japanese born on American soil, possessed of American citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. His words reflect the mounting paranoia. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover reports no evidence of Japanese-American espionage, but facts matter little in the rising tide of fear. March 30th, 1942. Bainbridge Island, Washington. The Mochizuki family stands on their porch, suitcases in hand. Military police trucks wait at the end of their driveway. They can take only what they can carry. The rest must be sold or abandoned. Mrs. Mochizuki clutches a photograph of her son in an American military uniform. The irony is devastating. While her son trains to fight for America, his family is being removed as a threat to national security. April 1942. Santa Anita Racetrack, California. Horse stalls, hastily converted into living quarters, now house 18,000 Japanese Americans. The stench of manure still permeates the wooden planks. Fred Korematsu, who will later challenge the constitutionality of the internment all the way to the Supreme Court, watches families unload their meager possessions. It was as if we were animals, he would later testify. Meanwhile, at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Japanese-American volunteers train in segregated units, their families behind barbed wire. In Washington, D.C., War Department officials debate a controversial proposal, allowing Japanese-Americans to serve in combat units. Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy reviews the file marked Nisei Combat Unit, Classified. The military needs soldiers, but can America trust those? Whose parents and siblings live behind barbed wire? The question hangs in the air like the acrid smoke over Pearl Harbor, a question that thousands of Japanese-American soldiers would soon answer with their blood, February 1st, 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Private George Sakato stares at the American flag fluttering above the training grounds. The same flag that now flies over the barbed wire enclosures where his parents and sister are detained at the Gila River War Relocation Center in Arizona. His weathered hands grip his enlistment papers, a contract to die for a country that has imprisoned his family. The morning dew dampens his boots as he stands among hundreds of Japanese-American volunteers, many with families behind barbed wire, all willing to prove their loyalty in blood. Over 33,000 Japanese Americans would serve in the U.S. military during World War II, while 120,000 of their relatives remained imprisoned on American soil. How does a man fight for freedom abroad when his own family lacks it at home? The formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerged from one of America's darkest chapters. Following the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, fear and racial prejudice led to Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. This presidential decree authorized the forced removal of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes along the West Coast into hastily constructed internment camps. Businesses were abandoned, properties sold at fractions of their value, and constitutional rights suspended, all based on ancestry rather than evidence. Yet, remarkably, from behind these barbed wire fences came volunteers. On January 28, 1943, the War Department announced it would accept Japanese American soldiers into segregated combat units. Lieutenant General Delos Emmons, who had initially opposed arming Japanese Americans, was overruled by the War Department after intelligence reports consistently found no evidence of Japanese American disloyalty. The famous loyalty questionnaire, administered in the camps, asked two crucial questions: whether they would serve in combat and whether they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States. Colonel Charles Pence, the 442nd's first commanding officer, recalled the day the volunteers arrived at Camp Shelby. They came with chips on their shoulders, determined to prove something. I've never seen such determination in men before or since. The unit adopted "Go for broke" as their motto. Gambling slang meaning to risk everything on one great effort. It perfectly captured their commitment to prove their loyalty through sacrifice. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama wrote in his diary before deployment, "If we don't come back, our parents, brothers, sisters, and friends imprisoned in the relocation centers will be there to take our place and continue the fight for acceptance." The statistics were staggering. 9,486 volunteers from Hawaii, where Japanese Americans had not been interned, and 1,156 from the mainland camps. These men left behind families in places like Manzanar, Tule Lake, and Hart Mountain, dusty, desolate compounds surrounded by guard towers and machine guns. Private Masao Watanabe of K Company had to sign his enlistment papers while his parents watched from behind a fence at the Minidoka camp in Idaho. As they trained in Mississippi, many soldiers received letters describing the harsh conditions their families endured: cramped barracks, communal bathrooms, mess hall food, and the psychological torture of imprisonment without trial. Yet they trained harder, determined to prove their worth not just as soldiers, but as Americans. February 19, 1942, San Francisco, California. Private Fred Shiosaki stares at the Executive Order 9066 posted on telephone poles throughout his neighborhood. His hands tremble slightly as he reads the document authorizing the forced removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. The same hands that would soon grip an M1 rifle in defense of American freedom would now watch his parents be classified as enemy aliens. In this cruel irony, over 120,000 Japanese Americans would be imprisoned while their sons volunteered to die for America. April 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Sergeant Daniel Inouye sits at a weathered desk, pen hovering over paper. Rain hammers the barracks roof as he begins another letter to his father, imprisoned at Rower War Relocation Center in Arkansas. Dear Father, today we completed bayonet training. The irony is not lost on me that I trained to kill while you remain behind barbed wire. He pauses, considering whether to include details of the discrimination his unit faces even in uniform. He decides against it. His father has enough burdens. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, comprised almost entirely of Japanese Americans, trains rigorously while their families live in hastily constructed barracks surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire. These Nisei soldiers face a dual battle, proving their loyalty on foreign battlefields while their families endured the shame of imprisonment at home. The letters were our lifeline, recalled Technical Sergeant Yuki Minaga years later. We'd write about our training, our friends, our determination to serve with honor. They'd write back about makeshift gardens in the desert dust, cramped quarters, and the indignity of communal latrines without partitions. We carried these letters into battle, reminders of what we were fighting for. May 1944. The Italian Campaign. The 100th Infantry Battalion, later merged with the 442nd, pushes north through punishing terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Singles observes their determination with awe. These men fight with a ferocity I've never witnessed. They have something to prove that the rest of us don't. What Singles didn't fully comprehend was the psychological burden these soldiers carried. Each man knew that exceptional valor was required, not just to defeat fascism abroad, but to secure freedom for their families at home. Their battle cry became, "Go for broke," a gambling term meaning to risk everything on one great effort. From the blood-soaked hills of Italy to the dense forests of France, these soldiers wrote home whenever possible. Private George Sakato's letters to his sister at Post and Relocation Center never mentioned his heroics that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. Instead, he asked about their mother's health and whether the package of candy he sent had arrived. Scene Q, a blood-stained letter being carefully folded and placed in a helmet before battle. The War Department eventually recognized the painful contradiction. In January 1944, they reinstated the draft for Japanese Americans, effectively acknowledging their right to serve while thousands remained imprisoned. The message was clear. Their blood was welcome on the battlefield, even as their loyalty remained questioned at home. No other group of American soldiers has ever fought with the knowledge that their families were behind barbed wire in their own country. Historian Eric Mueller would later write. This unique psychological burden makes their sacrifice all the more extraordinary. October 28, 1944. The dense Vosges Mountains of eastern France. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team crawls through mud and fallen autumn leaves, his uniform soaked with rain and the blood of fallen comrades. Through the fog, he can make out the desperate faces of the trapped men of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, the Lost Battalion. Behind him, hundreds of Nisei soldiers, American men of Japanese descent, advance through withering German machine gun fire. The same men whose families languish behind barbed wire on American soil now risk everything to save fellow Americans who look nothing like them. The irony hangs heavy in the cold mountain air, as thick as the smoke from artillery shells. The Lost Battalion rescue operation would become the most costly battle for the 442nd RCT, a unit that would earn the title of the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in American military history. Yet as these men fought and died in the forests of France, their parents, wives, and children remained imprisoned in American internment camps, classified as enemy aliens by executive order 9066. Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Purcell, commander of the lost battalion, had been cut off with 275 men for nearly a week, surrounded by German forces in the rugged terrain. Previous rescue attempts had failed. The 442nd, already exhausted from weeks of continuous combat, was ordered to break through at any cost. Colonel Charles Pence, the 442nd's commanding officer, knew what that cost would be, but the orders were clear. For 7 brutal days, the Nisei soldiers fought uphill through dense forests, minefields, and booby traps. Private George Sakato of Company E would later recall, "We knew what we were getting into. The Germans had the high ground. They could see us coming. But we had no choice. Those were American boys trapped up there." Sakato would earn the Distinguished Service Cross, later upgraded to the Medal of Honor, for single-handedly destroying a German strongpoint and leading a charge that captured 34 prisoners. The human cost was staggering. The 442nd began the rescue operation with approximately 2,143 men. By the time they reached the lost battalion on October 30th, they had suffered 814 casualties to save 211 men. Company K entered the battle with 186 men. Only 17 remained standing at the end. Company SI began with 185. Just 8 were left unhurt. Staff Sergeant Robert Kuroda charged multiple German machine gun nests alone, destroying them with grenades before being killed. Private Barney Hajiro eliminated 2 machine gun positions and killed 2 enemy snipers before being wounded. Private First Class Joe Nishimoto used a bar to silence an enemy machine gun position that had pinned down his platoon for hours. What makes these acts of heroism even more profound is that these men were fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. When Private Masao Awakuni was asked why he fought so hard, he responded, "I wanted to show that I was just as good an American as anybody else." The bitter irony was not lost on the men of the 442nd. Technical Sergeant Gordon Yamashiro wrote in a letter home, "We're out here fighting for democracy and justice while our families are denied those very things back home." The letter was censored, but the sentiment was shared by many Nisei soldiers who fought with extraordinary valor while carrying this double burden. Scene cue. As the 442nd finally breaks through to the lost battalion, the camera pans across the faces of the rescuers and rescued, Americans all, yet separated by a gulf of experience that few could comprehend. February 1st, 1943. Washington, D.C. Secretary of War Henry Stimson stands at a podium, his voice echoing through the press room as he announces a decision that would forever alter the course of American military history. Behind him, a large map of Europe hangs ominously, shadowed by the uncertain tides of war. The privilege of fighting for one's country, he declares, should be accorded to every loyal American citizen, regardless of ancestry. The irony hangs heavy in the air. Thousands of Japanese Americans deemed loyal enough to die for their country, yet not trusted enough to live freely within it. The announcement came after months of fierce debate within the Roosevelt administration. Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy had pushed for the creation of a segregated Japanese-American combat unit, arguing it would serve both military needs and political purposes. "These men will prove their loyalty in blood," he reportedly told the president. Meanwhile, behind barbed wire at the Manzanar internment camp in California, 23-year-old Fred Toyosaburo Korematsu had been arrested and convicted for refusing evacuation orders, his Supreme Court case still pending. A stark reminder of the constitutional crisis unfolding on American soil. The call for volunteers came as a shock to the internment camps. Men who had been classified as 4C, enemy aliens ineligible for military service, were suddenly being asked to volunteer for combat duty while their families remained imprisoned. At the Minidoka War Relocation Center in Idaho, mess halls fell silent as young men contemplated an impossible choice: refuse and be branded disloyal, or fight for a country that had stripped them of their constitutional rights. Go for broke, the Hawaiian gambling term meaning to risk everything, became the unit's motto. It perfectly captured the all-or-nothing gamble these men were taking. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil R. Miller, selected to command the 422nd Regimental Combat Team, watched as 10,000 men volunteered from Hawaii, 33% of the eligible Nisei population there. From the mainland camps, the response was more measured but no less significant. 156 men stepped forward from behind barbed wire. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in April 1943, the newly formed 442nd began training under the scorching southern sun. The unit brought together two distinct groups: the Buddha Heads from the mainland camps and the Kotonks from Hawaii. Initial tensions between these groups dissolved during shared hardships of training and mutual understanding of their unique position in American history. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama from Topaz Internment Camp wrote in his diary, "Today I swore to defend the Constitution of the United States, the same Constitution that could not protect my family. I do this not despite the injustice, but because of it. Someone must prove what America means." His words, preserved in the National Archives, capture the profound contradiction these soldiers embodied. By August 1943, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team stood assembled, 3,800 men prepared to enter the European theater. Colonel Charles W. Pence, addressing the unit before deployment, remarked, "You are now ready to fight, and you will have to fight twice as hard as any other American soldier, once against the enemy and once against prejudice." His words proved prophetic as the 442nd prepared to depart for Italy, leaving behind families still confined by their own government, their loyalty questioned even as they prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, 1943. Gila River War Relocation Center, Arizona. Masao Watanabe's mother sits beneath the harsh desert sun, her fingers trembling as she writes to her son, serving with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Dust infiltrates everything: her barracks, her clothing, her lungs. Outside, temperatures reach 115 degrees. Inside the hastily constructed barracks, it's even hotter. The irony is crushing. Her son fights for American freedom while she lives behind barbed wire on American soil. "Please don't worry about us," she writes, carefully omitting details of the camp's squalid conditions. "We are managing well. Focus on your duty and return safely." Words of reassurance flowing from prisoner to soldier, an inversion of wartime correspondence that defies comprehension. The home front for Japanese-American soldiers wasn't suburban victory gardens or scrap metal drives. It was 10 hastily constructed concentration camps housing 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them American citizens, forcibly removed from their homes following Executive Order 926, signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. Monica Sohn, a Nisei woman interned at Minidoka, wrote in her memoir, "The irony of parents in concentration camps waving goodbye to their sons going to fight for American democracy was almost more than one could bear." Scene Q. A military postal worker sorts through hundreds of letters. pausing at envelopes with return addresses from places like Manzanar, Hart Mountain, and Tule Lake, America's concentration camps. The censorship was relentless. Camp authorities routinely blacked out passages in outgoing mail that mentioned poor conditions. Lieutenant Colonel John L. DeWitt, who oversaw the internment program, justified this surveillance. A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not. At Manzanar Camp in California, Mary Nakahara, later Mary Koshiyama, who would become a prominent civil rights activist, organized the Manzanar Fair Play Committee, which sent care packages and letters to Japanese American soldiers overseas. Their correspondence became a lifeline, tangible proof that someone waited for their return, even if that someone lived behind barbed wire. The most difficult thing, wrote Sergeant Ben Kuroki, one of the few Japanese Americans to serve in the Army Air Forces, was knowing my family was imprisoned while I risked my life in combat. Every mission I flew, I carried that weight. In an extraordinary display of bureaucratic cruelty, the U.S. government sent draft notices to young men in the camps. Those who refused induction on principle, arguing they wouldn't serve while their constitutional rights were violated, faced federal imprisonment. The no-no boys, who answered no to loyalty questionnaire, questions about willingness to serve and allegiance to America, faced ostracism even within their own community. Meanwhile, at Topaz Relocation Center in Utah, Chio Okumura received news that her son had been wounded in Italy. Camp administrators offered no support services, no counseling. She sat alone in her barrack, clutching the telegram, surrounded by other families experiencing the same cruel paradox. Their sons bleeding for a country that had imprisoned their parents. But what the letters from camp revealed most powerfully was an unbreakable spirit. Despite everything, most internees encouraged their sons to serve with honor, to prove through sacrifice what should never have needed, proven their American loyalty. Little did they know, these letters would become historical documents of extraordinary significance, testament to patriotism under the most unconscionable circumstances America could impose on its own citizens. October 26, 1944. The densely forested Vosges Mountains, eastern France. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team presses his body against the sodden earth as German artillery transforms the forest around him into splinters and smoke. The rain-soaked soil beneath his uniform bears a bitter irony. He fights for American soil while his parents remain imprisoned on it. Through the deafening explosions, he hears Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Single's order, rescue the lost battalion at all costs. The lost battalion, in reality the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division, had pushed too far into enemy territory. 275 Texan soldiers now found themselves surrounded by German forces on 3 sides, with a steep cliff at their backs. For 5 desperate days, they had been cut off from supplies, ammunition running critically low, wounded men dying without medical attention. 3 previous rescue attempts had failed. Now, the Army turned to the Nisei soldiers, the Japanese Americans of the 442nd, as their last hope. The cruel paradox was inescapable. As the 442nd prepared the rescue mission, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans, including the families of many of these same soldiers, remained confined behind barbed wire in American internment camps. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, had authorized their mass incarceration without trial or evidence. Private George Sakato, preparing his weapon for the coming assault, had volunteered from behind the barbed wire of the Gila River internment camp in Arizona, leaving his parents still imprisoned. The rescue operation would become one of the most costly and heroic actions in American military history. The 442nd faced not only a determined German force, but also treacherous terrain, dense forest, steep hills, and open fields covered by enemy machine guns. Colonel Charles Pence, commanding officer of the 442nd, knew the mission's terrible cost, but understood its necessity. "These boys have something to prove," he reportedly told his staff officers. The night before the final push, Staff Sergeant Kazuo Komodo wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we move out at dawn. The Germans have good positions up there. Many of us won't be coming back. But those Texas boys need us, and we won't let them down. Maybe then America will see we're Americans too." The assault began at 0700 hours on October 27th. 3 companies of the 402nd pushed forward through murderous fire. By nightfall, they had gained only 50 yards, at the cost of 21 dead and 156 wounded. But they pushed on. Private First Class Joe Nishimoto destroyed a German machine gun nest with a daring flanking maneuver, while Staff Sergeant Robert Kuroda eliminated another that had pinned down an entire platoon. Both men would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, Kuroda posthumously. The fighting was so intense that Company K of the 442nd, which began the rescue operation with 186 men, would end it with only 17 soldiers still standing. Yet they never faltered. As Lieutenant Colonel Singles later wrote in his official report, "I have never seen such determination and disregard for danger. These Japanese Americans overcame terrain and resistance that I thought impassable. By October 30th, 1944, the seemingly impossible had been achieved. The 442nd had broken through to the lost battalion. The cost, 8 and 14 casualties to save 201 men. November 1st, 1942. Camp Savage, Minnesota." 28-year-old Kazuo Komodo stands at rigid attention as frigid wind cuts through his uniform. His fingers, numb from cold, clutch a letter from his mother. Her words, penned from behind the barbed wire of Manzanar internment camp, haunt him. "We are American in our hearts, even if they treat us like enemies." Outside, snow blankets the training grounds where Nisei soldiers prepare to serve a country that has imprisoned their families. The bitter irony is not lost on any of them. They will translate enemy communications while their parents sleep on cots in tar paper barracks surrounded by armed guards. The Military Intelligence Service, MIS, represented one of the most extraordinary paradoxes of World War II. While 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps following Executive Order 9066, approximately 6,000 Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, served in the MIS, performing critical intelligence work that remained classified for decades. General Charles Willoughby, intelligence chief for General MacArthur, would later declare, "The Nisei saved countless Allied lives and shortened the Pacific War by 2 years." Yet, as these men translated captured documents, interrogated prisoners, and intercepted radio transmissions, many did so knowing their parents and siblings lived as prisoners of their own government. Take Technical Sergeant Takajiro Higa, who in April 1945 found himself translating for U.S. forces during the Battle of Okinawa, the very island where he was born. As American shells pounded the landscape of his childhood, Higa used his knowledge of local dialects and terrain to save civilians hiding in caves, all while his family remained detained at Gila River War Relocation Center in Arizona. The most dangerous job was cave flushing, Higa later recalled in a documented interview. I would approach cave entrances where Japanese soldiers and civilians were hiding and call out in Japanese, trying to convince them to surrender. Many times I was shot at, but I kept thinking of those innocent civilians trapped inside. The classified nature of MIS work meant these contributions remained largely unknown. While the all-Japanese-American 402nd Regimental Combat Team fighting in Europe became the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history, the Pacific Theater's Nisei linguists operated in shadows. They intercepted communications revealing Japanese naval movements before the Battle of Midway. They translated captured operation orders and maps. They interrogated prisoners who revealed critical intelligence about enemy positions and strength. At Fort Snelling and Camp Savage, MIS language school instructors like John Iso pushed students through grueling 14-hour days, knowing their translations could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Meanwhile, many received letters from family describing the humiliation of communal bathrooms, inadequate food, and the psychological torture of imprisonment without trial. Scene Q. A Nisei soldier hunches over captured documents by lamplight, translating as tears silently track down his face, while holding a wrinkled family photograph from behind barbed wire. October 1944. The dense Vosges mountains of eastern France. A cold mist hangs between the towering pines as men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team crawl through mud and fallen leaves. Their breath forms small clouds in the frigid air. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Komodo clutches a photo of his parents, imprisoned at Manzanar internment camp in California, as he prepares to lead his men into what many would later call a suicide mission. Go for broke, their motto emblazoned on their unit insignia. For these Japanese-American soldiers, it meant risking everything when they had already lost nearly everything. The irony was not lost on them, fighting for a country that had stripped their families of their homes, businesses, and freedom. The 442nd RCT had already proven itself in brutal combat across Italy and France, earning a reputation as one of the most effective fighting units in the European theater. But nothing compared to what awaited them in the Vosges Mountains, the rescue of the lost battalion. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, approximately 275 Texas National Guardsmen, had advanced too far ahead of the main Allied line and become surrounded by German forces on October 24, 1944. Cut off from supplies, ammunition dwindling, wounded men dying without medical attention, they faced annihilation. Previous rescue attempts had failed with heavy casualties. Lieutenant General John E. Dahlquist, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, turned to the Japanese Americans of the 432nd. The order came down: breakthrough at all costs. Captain Daniel Inouye, future U.S. Senator from Hawaii, later recalled, "Many of us had received letters from our parents in these American concentration camps telling us to do our best, to fight well, to bring honor to our families and our people." As he led his men forward, Inouye carried these words with him, along with the knowledge that his family remained behind barbed wire in America. The statistics of what followed remain staggering. For 6 days, The Nisei soldiers fought through heavily fortified German positions, dense forests, landmines, booby traps, machine gun nests, and artillery barrages. They gained ground measured in yards, then feet, paying for each advance with blood. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama wrote in his field diary on October 28th, "Situation bad. Enemy dug in with plenty of automatic weapons and artillery support. Lost 15 men today. Thompson hit bad. Don't know if we can break through, but we'll die trying." By October 30th, 1944, the 442nd had suffered over 800 casualties to rescue 211 men of the lost battalion. Companies I and K, which led the final breakthrough, began with 400 men combined and finished with just 17 still standing. The 442nd had literally decimated itself to save fellow Americans, while their own families remained prisoners of their own government. When the surviving members of the lost battalion were finally reached, many of the Texas soldiers initially refused to believe their rescuers were Americans. Private First Class Ichiro Imamura remembered. They couldn't believe it was Japanese Americans who rescued them. They thought we were some kind of Japanese trick. We had to convince them we were Americans too. General Dahlquist later ordered the entire 442nd to assemble for a recognition ceremony, unaware of how few remained. When informed that the men standing before him were all that remained of the combat team, he was reportedly moved to tears. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack that would forever change the lives of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Among them, the Masuda family of Orange County, California. As smoke still billowed from the wreckage of American battleships, FBI agents were already knocking on their door. Kazuo Masuda watched as his father was taken away, the first of many separations his family would endure. What followed was perhaps the most profound test of loyalty in American military history. By March 1942, Executive Order 9066 had authorized the forced removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. The Masudas and thousands of others were given just days to sell their homes, businesses, and possessions, often for pennies on the dollar. Total estimated property losses, $400 million, equivalent to $6.6 billion today. At Post-in-War Relocation Center in the Arizona desert, Mary Masuda, Kazuo's sister, writes in her diary, "The dust gets into everything. Our barrack has no privacy, just one room for all of us. And yet my brother Kazuo speaks only of enlisting. How can he fight for a country that imprisons his family?" This question haunted thousands of young Japanese-American men as they made an impossible choice. Behind barbed wire, families were torn between survival and patriotism. The government's loyalty questionnaire, administered in 1943, forced painful decisions. Questions 27 and 28 asked if they would serve in combat and swear unqualified allegiance to America, while renouncing any loyalty to Japan. A wrong answer could separate families further. Sergeant Kazuo Masuda of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team writes from the European front to his sister Mary at Poston, "When you receive this package, please set aside the medals. What I fight for is not recognition, but a future where our family can return home with dignity." His words traveled across an ocean while his family remained prisoners in their own country. From Camp Minidoka in Idaho, Private First Class. Frank Hachia's mother received his letters describing training as a military intelligence service linguist. "I am treated as an American soldier," he wrote, "while you live behind fences." Hachia would later die in the Philippines while attempting to gather intelligence, his body riddled with American bullets, fired by soldiers who mistook him for the enemy. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama of the 442nd wrote from Italy, "The news of Topaz camp conditions reaches us even here. Please don't worry about me. We are making a name for ourselves." Indeed they were. While the 442nd fought in 8 major campaigns across Europe, earning 9,286 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor, they carried the weight of knowing their families lived as prisoners. The letters crossed in both directions, bearing love, worry, and determination. They were censored, delayed, sometimes lost. But they formed the invisible threads connecting 2 fronts of the same war. One fought with weapons in Europe and the Pacific. The other fought with dignity and perseverance behind barbed wire on American soil. Scene cue. A weathered hand unfolds a letter, dust from the camp settling on its creases as tears fall silently onto paper that traveled from the blood-soaked fields of Italy. November 1st, 1941. Fort Snelling, Minnesota. 28-year-old Kazuo Yamane sits in a classroom, hunched over captured Japanese military documents. His fingers trace the complex kanji characters as he translates vital intelligence that will soon save thousands of American lives. Outside, snow falls on the Military Intelligence Service Language School, where Nisei soldiers train in secret. The irony is crushing. As Yamane decodes enemy secrets, his father sits behind barbed wire at an internment camp in Hawaii, branded an enemy of the state simply for his Japanese heritage. The Military Intelligence Service, MIS, represented one of America's most powerful yet hidden weapons in the Pacific theater. Comprised primarily of Japanese-American soldiers, these linguists served as translators, interpreters, and interrogators, while their families remained imprisoned in internment camps across the United States. Major General Charles Willoughby, General MacArthur's chief of intelligence, would later declare that these Nisei linguists shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved possibly 1 million American lives. By August 1942, Executive Order 9066 had forced approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes into hastily constructed internment camps. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army actively recruited from this same population to fill its desperate need for Japanese language specialists. The contradiction was stark and painful. These men were trusted with the nation's most sensitive intelligence operations, while their parents, siblings, and children were deemed too dangerous to remain in their own homes. Technical Sergeant Harry Fukuhara exemplified this painful duality. While translating captured documents on Leyte in the Philippines in December 1944, he received a letter from his mother at the Gila River War Relocation Center in Arizona. "I do not understand why I am here while you wear an American uniform," she wrote. "But I am proud you fight for what you believe." That same week, Fukuhara's translations revealed Japanese troop movements that helped secure the American position on the island. The MIS linguists operated under extreme pressure, both professional and psychological. They faced the constant threat of friendly fire from American troops who couldn't distinguish them from the enemy. During the Battle of Okinawa in April 1945, Sergeant Hoichi Bob Kubo crawled into a cave where 122 Japanese civilians were hiding, many contemplating suicide rather than surrender. Speaking in Japanese, Kubo convinced them the Americans would treat them humanely. As he led them to safety, an American sentry nearly shot him, mistaking him for an enemy soldier. The statistics tell a story of extraordinary service amid extraordinary discrimination. Over 6,000 Nisei served in the MIS throughout the Pacific Theater. Their work resulted in the translation of 20 million pages of documents and countless interrogations that provided critical intelligence. Yet their service remained classified for decades after the war, their contributions hidden from a public that had supported their families' incarceration. Scene cue. A Nisei translator sits alone in a tent, reading a letter from his imprisoned family while Japanese military documents wait for translation on his desk. Duty and heartbreak side by side. October 1945. San Francisco Harbor. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama of the 402nd Regimental Combat Team stands at the ship's rail, the Golden Gate Bridge looming ahead. His chest bears the Purple Heart and Bronze Star, medals earned in the blood-soaked hills of Italy. Yet, as the California coastline draws near, his thoughts are not of victory parades, but of Camp Topaz in Utah, where his parents and sisters still live behind barbed wire. The bitter irony hangs in the salt-laden air. He returns a hero to a country that imprisoned his family for the crime of their ancestry. As Japanese-American soldiers returned home from the European theater, they faced a profoundly changed America. The war that had devastated Europe and the Pacific had transformed the United States as well. But for Nisei veterans, homecoming meant confronting the aftermath of Executive Order 966, the presidential decree that had forced 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes into desolate internment camps scattered across the American interior. We fought 2 wars, recalled Daniel Inouye, future U.S. Senator who lost his right arm serving with the 442nd in Italy. One against the Germans, and another against prejudice. His words captured the dual battle these soldiers waged, one abroad with bullets and blood, another at home against suspicion and hate. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, comprised almost entirely of Japanese Americans, returned as the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. They had earned 9,486 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, and 7 Presidential Unit citations. The 100th Infantry Battalion, which later merged with the 492nd, suffered a 314% casualty rate, meaning many men were wounded multiple times, yet returned to battle. Scene cue. A soldier in uniform stands before his family's former grocery store, now occupied by new owners, the family name scraped from the window. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda had been killed in action in Italy, posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism. When his family tried to return to their California farm after his death, they were met with threats of violence. It took the intervention of Army General Joseph Stilwell and a young actor named Ronald Reagan to escort the Masuda family back to their home amid protests from neighbors who didn't want Japs returning to their community. For many Nisei soldiers, the most painful homecoming was to discover what remained of their families' former lives. Property had been sold for pennies on the dollar, businesses liquidated, and savings depleted. Technical Sergeant George Sakato, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, returned to find his family had lost their home and business in Colton, California. "We proved our loyalty by shedding our blood," said Chaplain Hiro Higuchi of the 442nd, who counseled countless returning soldiers struggling with the contradiction of their service and their treatment. Yet, when we came home, we still had to prove we were Americans. Despite these bitter realities, the heroism of these soldiers began slowly changing American hearts and minds. In 1946, President Harry Truman decorating the 482nd at the White House, declared, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won." April 29th, 1945. The men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team stand in formation as the spring sun glints off their helmets. Their uniforms bear the blood and mud of the Italian campaign, but their faces show a grim pride. 3,000 miles away, their parents and siblings peer through barbed wire at the dusty expanse of Manzanar, Hart Mountain, and Tool Lake. American concentration camps on American soil. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerged from the war as the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in American military history. Their motto, "Go for broke," became synonymous with their willingness to sacrifice everything for a country that had imprisoned their families. By war's end, these Nisei soldiers had earned an astonishing 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, and over 9,000 Purple Hearts. Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Persall, who commanded the 100th Battalion in Italy, would later write, "They showed their Americanism not by words, but by deeds." These men never faltered, though. They knew their families were behind barbed wire. Their record speaks for itself. The human cost was staggering. The 442nd suffered a 314% casualty rate, meaning they had to replace their entire fighting force 3 times over. In the rescue of the lost battalion in the Vosges Mountains of France, they suffered 800 casualties to save 211 trapped Texans. When the 442nd returned from this mission, only 17 men answered roll call in K Company. The rest were dead or wounded. Yet even as these men bled for America in Europe, racial prejudice continued at home. Sergeant Kazuo Masuda was killed in Italy after single-handedly holding off enemy forces. When his family tried to bury him in his hometown cemetery in California, they were told, "We don't want any Japs in our cemetery." It took the intervention of General Joseph Stilwell himself to ensure Masuda received a proper military burial. The legacy of these men transcended the battlefields. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized for the internment and provided reparations to survivors. At the signing ceremony, Reagan specifically cited the 442nd Service. "Blood that has soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world. The only country not founded on race, but on a way, an ideal." Daniel Inouye, who lost his arm fighting with the 442nd before becoming a United States Senator from Hawaii, reflected decades later. "The lessons learned must remain as a grave reminder of what we must not allow to happen again to any group." Scene cue. Camera pans across aging faces of 442nd veterans at the 2010 Congressional Gold Medal Ceremony, their weathered hands touching medals that came at an unimaginable price. But perhaps the most profound legacy lies in a question still haunting American history. How could men fight so valiantly for a nation that had stripped their families of everything? Their answer came not in words, but in blood-soaked Italian mountains and French forests where they proved their loyalty was beyond question. April 1943. A weathered envelope arrives at Manzanar War Relocation Center in California's Owens Valley. Asako Takuno's hands tremble as she recognizes her son's handwriting. The desert dust settles on the letter as she carefully opens it, preserving every crease, every fold. Her son, Private First Class George Takuno of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, writes from Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Outside her barracks, armed guards patrol the perimeter of barbed wire that imprisons 10,000 Japanese Americans deemed enemy aliens by executive order under 9066. Meanwhile, her son trains to die for the country that imprisoned his family. Scene cue: a mother's weathered hands carefully unfolding a military letter, with barbed wire visible through the barrack window. The paradox was brutal and inescapable. By 1943, over 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the U.S. military, while approximately 120,000 of their family members remained imprisoned behind barbed wire in America's concentration camps. The War Department had initially classified Japanese Americans as 4 to C, enemy aliens, ineligible for military service. But facing manpower shortages and questions about Japanese American loyalty, the government reversed course, allowing Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, to volunteer for segregated combat units. The mail system became the tenuous lifeline between these divided worlds. Captain Daniel Inouye, who would later become a U.S. Senator from Hawaii, recalled how letters from his father sustained him through the brutal Italian campaign. "My father wrote to me every week, never mentioning the indignities of camp life. He would only say, 'America has given our family so much. Now, it is your turn to give back.'" These letters, often heavily censored by military and camp authorities, carried the emotional burden of families torn apart by contradictory government policies. At Jerome Relocation Center in Arkansas, Masako Miyamoto kept every letter from her husband serving in the military intelligence service. Camp authorities had limited Japanese Americans to bringing only what they could carry when evacuated from their homes. Family photographs, heirlooms, and keepsakes were abandoned. But these letters, these fragile paper connections, became the most precious possessions in the camps. The 402nd Regimental Combat Team's motto was "Go for broke," a Hawaiian gambling term, meaning to risk everything. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda embodied this spirit, fighting in Italy while his family languished at Gila River Relocation Center in Arizona. His letters home never revealed the horrors he witnessed. When news of his death reached the camp in August 1944, his mother collapsed. The Western Defense Command initially refused to allow the Masuda family to return to their California home for Kazuo's funeral, relenting only after public outcry. But what these letters couldn't express, what military and camp censors would never allow, was the rage, confusion, and divided loyalties these soldiers felt. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama of the 442nd wrote in his diary what he couldn't write home. "I am fighting for the rights of my family, even while they live like prisoners." How bitter the irony. That diary entry, found after his death at the Gothic Line in Italy, never reached his parents at Tule Lake. Little did these soldiers know their sacrifice would eventually help dismantle the very system that imprisoned their families. But in those lonely moments, reading and writing letters across barbed wire, that future remained painfully uncertain. Homecoming and delayed justice, the fight for recognition. Bernain, in 45, the docks of Seattle. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda's sister Mary stands solemnly, clutching the Distinguished Service Cross awarded posthumously to her brother who died fighting in Italy. Behind her, their family's internment camp identification tags dangle from her purse, a jarring juxtaposition of honor and humiliation. The war was over, but for Japanese American veterans returning home, a different battle was just beginning. Scene Q. A weathered hand placing an internment camp ID card beside a Purple Heart medal. "We fought 2 wars, recalled Daniel Inouye, future senator who lost his right arm with the 442nd in Italy. One against the enemy overseas, and another against prejudice at home. For the 33,000 Japanese Americans who served in the U.S. military during World War II, victory in Europe and the Pacific didn't translate to victory against discrimination. Nearly 70% of these soldiers had immediate family members still confined behind barbed wire when they returned home in uniform. The irony cut deep. Many Nisei veterans returned to find their family homes sold, businesses liquidated, and communities scattered. In Hood River, Oregon, the local American Legion post removed the names of 16 Japanese-American servicemen from the town's honor roll. When Medal of Honor recipient Sadao Munamori's mother attempted to purchase a home in Los Angeles in 1946, she was turned away due to restrictive housing covenants, despite her son having sacrificed his life by throwing himself on a grenade to save his fellow soldiers. America's conscience was tested, historian Eric Mueller noted, when men who had proven their loyalty with blood were denied the basic rights they had fought to protect. The fight for recognition began immediately. In 1946, the 402nd Veterans formed the Go for Broke National Veterans Association to advocate for their rights and preserve their legacy. Mike Masaoka, who had served as a spokesman for the Japanese American Citizens League before volunteering for the 402nd, became a tireless advocate for legislative change. Their efforts contributed significantly to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which finally allowed Issei, first-generation Japanese immigrants, to become naturalized citizens after decades of exclusion. Yet full recognition remained elusive. The government that had imprisoned their families while accepting their military service maintained an uncomfortable silence about this contradiction for decades. It wasn't until 1988, 43 years after the war's end, that the Civil Liberties Act provided a formal government apology and $20,000 in reparations to each surviving internee. By then, many Nisei veterans had already passed away. They had to wait too long to be recognized for their extraordinary loyalty, President Ronald Reagan acknowledged upon signing the act. In 2000, 22 Asian American veterans of the 100th 402nd finally received the Medal of Honor, upgraded from lesser decorations, after a review concluded that racial prejudice had denied them proper recognition. For many, including George Sakato, who had originally received the Distinguished Service Cross, this recognition came more than 50 years after their acts of heroism. "Better late than never," Sakato remarked quietly at the White House ceremony. "But we knew what we did." The delayed justice for these forgotten heroes reveals an uncomfortable truth. America's capacity to simultaneously produce both profound courage and profound injustice. Yet their story also demonstrates how the sacrifices of the few can eventually bend the moral arc of a nation toward justice, even if that justice arrives decades too late.